Please join me in welcoming Professor Card.
Peter Singer is a professor of philosophy at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. He also co-directs there the Institute for Ethics and Public Affairs, and he's as well deputy director of the Center for Human Bioethics. Professor Singer was educated at Oxford University, where he then also taught from 1971 to 1973. It was while he was a student at Oxford that he met a group of students who were vegetarians on ethical grounds. And this started him thinking on a set of issues that were new to him at that time, and that resulted in a book in 1975, very well known to members of this audience, Animal Liberation. I read that book in 1980, and it changed my eating habits forever, and many other kinds of habits as well. And since that time, I've taught from Professor Singer's work in many courses that I teach, not only the environmental ethics course. In 1975, there wasn't yet an animal liberation movement, and this book was very influential in establishing that movement. In 1990, he published a new edition of that work and found that he had to rewrite some of the chapters to tell the reader what has not changed since 1975, what has and what has not changed, and also to discuss the animal liberation movement and what aspects of it he agrees with and what aspects of it he doesn't. He's also taught at New York University, the University of Colorado in Boulder, the University of California at Irvine, and La Trobe University in Australia. And he's also written on other topics besides issues pertaining to animals and humans' treatment of other animals. His other books, for example, include Disobedience and Democracy, Marx, Hegel, Test Tube Babies, Embryo Experimentation, as well as other books on both practical and theoretical ethics. One of my favorites is The Great Apes Project, Equality Beyond Humanity, which appeared a couple of years ago and got a wonderful review just about a year ago in the New York Times Book Review. He's the author of the major article on ethics in the current issue of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and he co-edits the journal Bioethics. For fun, he engages in bushwalking, swimming, growing fruit and veggies, and writing. It's my very great pleasure, after teaching his work for all these years, to meet Professor Singer and to introduce him to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Card, for that very generous introduction, and thank you for your warm welcome. It's certainly a pleasure to be here in Madison and to be able to speak to you about these issues. I want to begin my talk tonight by describing to you a particular kind of institution that exists in the Netherlands. I'm taking my description from a published report of this institution. The people living in this institution had a special condition that made them different from us. It did not handicap them at all physically, but intellectually they were well below the normal human level. They could not speak, although they could make noises and gestures. In the institutions in which such people are usually kept, they spend a lot of their day simply rocking to and fro, not moving around much. But this institution was an unusual one in that it allowed its inmates the maximum possible freedom to live their own lives and even to form their own community. This freedom extended even to sexual relationships, which led to pregnancy, birth, and child rearing within the community. Under these circumstances, the behaviour of these inmates was much more varied than it had been in the conventional institutional settings. They rarely spent time alone, and they appeared to have no difficulty in understanding each other's vocalizations and gestures. They were physically active. They spent a lot of time outdoors, where they had access to a couple of acres of relatively natural land. They cooperated in many activities outdoors, even on one occasion, to the consternation of the supervisors, carrying a large fallen branch to one of the walls around the enclosure and propping it up as a kind of ladder so that they could climb over the wall. The observer whose report I've read was particularly interested in what he called the politics of the community. He found that the community always had a defined leader. The leader depended on the support of other members of the group. The leader had privileges, but also, it seemed, obligations. He had to cultivate the favour of others by sharing food and other treats. Fights would develop from time to time, but they would usually be followed by some conciliatory gestures, so that no member of the community remained forever outside it. If the leader became isolated and lost the support of many of the others, his days as leader were numbered. A simple ethical code could also be detected within the community. Its two basic rules, the observer commented, could be summed up as one good turn deserves another, and an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The breach of these rules apparently led to a sense of being wronged. For example, on one occasion, the report describes that one of the inmates, Henk, was fighting with Jan, and Gert, a third, came to Jan's assistance. Later, Henk attacked Gert, who gestured to Jan for assistance, but Jan did not come and help Gert, as Gert had helped him before. After the fight between Gert and Henk was over, Gert furiously attacked Jan, obviously angry that he had not repaid in kind the assistance that he'd previously given him. The mothers in this group were generally competent at nursing and rearing their children. They had close mother-child relationships that lasted for many years, and the death of a baby led to prolonged grieving behaviour. I say this specifically of the mothers because the group was not monogamous, and it was not always possible to tell who the father of a child was, so fathers did not play a significant role in the rearing of their children. In view of the very limited mental capacities that these inmates had been considered to possess, the observer was impressed by instances of behaviour that clearly showed intelligent planning. I've already mentioned the episode in which they cooperated to try and climb over the wall. In another example, two young mothers had difficulty stopping their small children from fighting. An older mother, who was a considerable authority figure in the community, was dozing nearby. One of the younger mothers woke her and pointed in the direction of the squabbling infants. The older mother made the appropriate stern noises and gestures, and the children, suitably intimidated, stopped fighting. The observer was also interested in seeing just how far ahead these people could think. So he presented one of them with two series of 5 clear plastic boxes. The boxes were locked, but they were of clear plastic. Each of them required a different and distinctively shaped key to be opened. And at the end of one of the series of 5 boxes, there was a treat, a food that the inmates all liked. Whereas the other series of boxes led to nothing, just to an empty box. The key to the first box in each series lay beside it, but you had to then, to get the food treat, you had to work out which key would lead to the next box and the next box and the next box that would eventually lead to the box that held the treat, rather than the box at the other end in the other series that held nothing. The inmate was able to succeed in this quite complex task of planning ahead. The inmates' own awareness of what they were doing was well shown by their extensive practice of deceit. On one occasion, for example, after a fight, it was noticeable that the loser limped badly when in the presence of the victor, but not when alone. Presumably by pretending to be more seriously hurt than he really was, he hoped for some kind of sympathy, or at least mercy, from the conqueror. And other forms, quite elaborate forms of deceit, focused around, and this will be no surprise, I guess, for anyone who's observed human relationships, these other forms of deceit focused around sexual relationships. because, as I've already mentioned, sexual relationships were not monogamous, but the leader tried to prevent others from having sexual relationships with his favourites. To get around this, flirtations leading up to sexual intercourse were conducted with a good deal of discretion, so as not to attract the leader's attention. Now, I've given you quite a detailed description of this community because I want to raise an ethical question about it and about the way in which people with this condition were regarded by those who looked after them. In the eyes of their supervisors, the inmates did not have the same kind of right to life as normal human beings. Though treated with care and with consideration for their welfare, they were seen as clearly inferior, and their lives were accorded much less value than the lives of normal human beings. When one of them was killed in the course of a dispute over who should be leader, the killing was not considered the same as the killing of a normal human being. Moreover, in other institutions, not the particular one on which this report is based, but other institutions, both in the Netherlands and in the United States, people with this condition are deliberately experimented upon, even infected with diseases such as hepatitis or AIDS, and in some cases they die as the result of this experiment. I want to ask you how you regard that situation. Do you think of it as a moral outrage? Or do you think of it as reasonable and proper given the limited intellectual capacities of the people I've described? Well, if you've been thinking about that question just now while I've been speaking, I expect that your answer to it will vary according to the mental image that you formed of the inmates of the community I've described. I've referred to them as people. In doing so, I have in mind the definition of a person offered by the 17th century British philosopher John Locke. Locke said a person is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself the same thinking thing in different times and places. I think the intellectual capacities that I've described of the inmates of this institution show that they amply fill Locke's account of a person. And note that on Locke's account, there is no particular reference to the species of the person. But because in our common ordinary day use of the word person and the use of the word people, which I'm simply taking here as the plural for person, in our ordinary day usage, we immediately think of a person only as a member of the species Homo sapiens. So my use of the term may have misled you. It may have misled you to think that the community I was describing was a community of intellectually disabled human beings. My use of Dutch proper names for the chimpanzees involved in the fight probably reinforced that assumption. In that case, you probably also thought it very wrong that the lives of these people were accorded less value than those of normal human beings, and you were very likely shocked at the information I gave you that these inmates are sometimes experimented on in ways that bring about their death. But some of you, perhaps, aware of my particular interest in ethics and animals, may have been able to guess that the description was not one of human beings at all. The special condition to which I referred, that these people have, that makes them different for us, is the fact that they are members of the species Pan troglodytes. In other words, they're chimpanzees. The institution I described is Arnhem Zoo, a relatively progressive zoo in the Netherlands, not far from Amsterdam. The description comes from a book by Frans de Waal called Chimpanzee Politics. I took the liberty of just making two slight changes to that description. I gave human names to the chimpanzees involved in the fight, as I mentioned, and I added from a different study of chimpanzees the experiment involving the two series of plastic boxes. But those are the only changes are made to Duval's account. In every other respect, the capacities that I referred to of the chimpanzees, their behaviour, are the capacities to which he refers. Now, I want you to think for a moment about the difference in reaction that you, or at least most in our community, have if on the one hand you listen to that description, thinking of them as human beings with intellectual disabilities, and then learning that they are made subjects of lethal experiments, and on the other hand, thinking of them as apes, as chimpanzees, and receiving the same information. The reaction generally, I can't speak for you, the audience, I don't know you personally, you may all be different in this respect, but the reaction generally, of course, is one of much greater shock and outrage if these experiments are performed on intellectually disabled human beings than if they're performed on chimpanzees. And the question is, why should that reaction be so different? Before I explore that question a little more, let me just give you one further example of ways in which this reaction is different. We have had in the last 3 or 4 years, both in the United States and in Europe, cases of infants born with a condition known as Anencephaly, that is from a Greek term essentially meaning no brain. Infants born with Anencephaly have a brain stem. They are not brain dead, as that term is generally defined, because they have a functioning brain stem, but they have no higher brain. That cortex is simply missing. The skull is filled with fluid above that point or is incomplete. They have no capacity for consciousness and never can have, and they usually die within a few days of birth. But in these cases that I'm referring to, that have occurred both here and in Europe, parents of such babies have wished to try and salvage something from the tragedy of a birth that was so much less than they had hoped it would be. And they wish to offer their infants as organ donors. Recognising that those infants could not live more than a few days, they said, perhaps there's some other baby who has a heart defect who could have life, that my infant then would at least in some sense have contributed to something worthwhile rather than dying pointlessly. And in all of those cases of which I'm aware, the courts have refused to sanction the removal of the heart of the anencephalic organ, of the anencephalic baby, for donation. They have said, these babies are not brain dead, they are alive. True, they have no capacity for consciousness. True, they almost certainly will be dead in a few days or a week or two, but they are living human beings. You cannot remove their hearts. In contrast, around the same time in Pittsburgh, Dr. Thomas Starzl, a transplant surgeon, twice removed the liver from a healthy baboon and transplanted it into the body of a patient who was dying from liver disease. The baboon, of course, a healthy, sentient, intelligent and responsive animal, was killed immediately after the liver was taken. In both cases, the patient died within at most a couple of months afterwards. Here, no court stepped in to tell Dr. Starzl that he could not kill a baboon in order to take its liver. Instead, the debate focused largely over whether this would or would not be a promising way of obtaining organs for transplantation. Here again, then, we have an example of this sharp distinction between our own species and all others. The most hopelessly handicapped and doomed member of our own species still has a life that, in accordance with our ethic, is more sacrosanct than the life of the most intelligent, sentient and responsive non-human animal. And although perhaps that description ought to be reserved for a chimpanzee rather than a baboon, it's clear that the law would not have made a distinction between a chimpanzee and a baboon in that sort of operation. If Dr. Starzl had had a chimpanzee available, he could, with equal legal impunity, have removed the liver from that chimpanzee. Well, let's look for a moment at how our ethic got to this point. It's a story that's been told before. I've told it myself in one of the chapters in Animal Liberation. I won't go into details here. But basically, we start off with a Western tradition that has two roots. One in the Jewish scriptures, which tell us that after making the animals, God then created man in his own image, so that humans alone are made in the image of God. And God then gave man dominion over the other animals, told him to go forth and subdue the earth and have dominion over it. So we have that tradition of a separate creation for for man, man being more like God than any of the other creatures, and being given dominion over the other creatures. And on the other hand, we have a Greek tradition coming from Aristotle, which also sees the universe as existing only for man. Sees plants as existing for the sake of animals, and animals as existing for the sake of the higher or more rational being, that is, humans. With these roots, the Western tradition for more than 2 millennia regarded humans as the pinnacle of creation. And not only as the pinnacle of creation, but as separated from all other animals by a very wide gulf. And then, only about 150 years ago, in 1838, a young scientist made the following observation in his notebook. Man, in his arrogance, thinks himself a great work, worthy of the interposition of a deity. More humble, and I believe true, to consider him created from animals. The young scientist who made that observation, of course, was Charles Darwin. It took another 33 years before he felt he had accumulated enough evidence to publish in The Descent of Man his case for saying that human beings are descended from animals. But when he did publish this, he began to undermine the foundations of the entire Western way of thinking about the place of our species in nature. From then on, we knew that we too were animals and had a natural origin as other animals did. Yet, for more than a century after that, that Western view of the special status of animals has seemed to simply hang there, although its foundations have been knocked out from under it. It's the intellectual equivalent of defying gravity. But now it's been under considerably more attack in the last 20 years from a number of different sources. I'll just briefly mention some of them. One is the ecology movement. We're about to celebrate Earth Day. The first Earth Day saw a significantly greater awareness in the fact that because we have regarded the planet as our quarry to use as we please, our quarry and also our waste disposal unit, we have made a mess of things and are continuing to make a mess of them. And this gave rise to a lot of questioning about where this attitude comes from, a lot of contrasting between this attitude and that of some indigenous peoples of the world, for example. And this made us reassess this Western tradition of dominion and suggested that perhaps that was something that we ought to reconsider. A second wave came in the 1970s with the emergence of the animal liberation or animal rights movement, which demanded an end to speciesism. That term was not one of my making, although I did popularise the term speciesism in my book, Animal Liberation. It was invented by an Oxford psychologist, Richard Ryder, who I had the honour to know when I was an Oxford student and then teacher. And Ryder used it, as I use it, to draw a parallel between our attitudes to non-human animals and the attitudes of racists, in fact racists of a particularly blatant sort, to those whom they regarded as inferior races. In both cases, you have this inner moral group which has the power to subdue, control, dominate and exploit another group, an outer group. And you have the inner group saying that it is superior and concocting some story or ideology that gives it the right to rule over that other group. We have acknowledged now the arbitrariness of that boundary, where it's a boundary drawn within the circle of human beings.